The air in the grand atrium of the Astoria Museum crackled with the energy of a billion-dollar thunderstorm. At its epicenter was Julian Thorne, a titan of industry, his arm possessively wrapped around the waist of Isabella Vance, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and modern as the skyscraper bearing his name. They were the undisputed king and queen of the night, their laughter echoing over the clinking of champagne flutes. But a storm was gathering at the gilded doors. A ghost from Julian's past was about to walk in, and she wasn't just wearing a revenge dress. She was wearing the one jewel he thought he owned forever, a gem so legendary it had its own name. This isn't just a story about a scorned wife. It's about the moment a queen presumed exiled walks back into her kingdom to reclaim her throne. The Metropolitan Legacy Gala was not merely a party. It was a carefully curated ecosystem where power was the currency and visibility was the ultimate prize. Julian Thorne navigated this environment with the predatory grace of a shark in its home waters. He was a man forged in the crucible of hostile takeovers and brutal market gambles, and his presence radiated an aura of unassailable victory. His suit, a bespoke creation by a Savile Row tailor whose name was only whispered, fit him like a second skin. At his side, Isabella Vance was a vision in crimson, a stark, fiery contrast to the ballroom's opulent gold and cream decor. Her dress, a daring piece of haute couture, seemed to cling to her as if, by sheer force of will, its plunging neckline a bold declaration of her status as the newest, most coveted asset in Julian's portfolio. "Darling, you've captivated everyone," Julian murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He squeezed her waist, a gesture that was half affection, half ownership. "Alistair Finch hasn't been able to take his eyes off you. I believe his portfolio just dropped another point in sheer envy." Isabella laughed, a sound like perfectly chilled champagne bubbles popping. "Let him look. He can't afford the view." Her gaze swept across the room, a calculated scan of the hierarchy. She was a master of this game too. She had risen from obscurity, a gallery curator, with ambition to become the woman on the arm of one of New York's most ruthless billionaires. She understood that her position was precarious, entirely dependent on Julian's continued fascination. Tonight was her coronation, the public unveiling of her as the permanent replacement for the woman who had come before. The woman who was by all accounts supposed to be broken. Serafina Valerius. The divorce had been finalized 6 months prior. It was a vicious affair played out, not in screaming matches, but in the cold, precise language of legal filings and non-disclosure agreements. Julian had been generous by his own metric. He had given her a settlement that would ensure she lived in comfort for the rest of her life, provided she disappeared. He had kept the empire, the penthouse overlooking Central Park, the Hamptons estate, and he had assumed all the symbols of their shared reign. "To us," he said, raising his glass. The crystal rang as he tapped it against hers. "To new beginnings, and burying the past." Isabella added her ruby-red lips, curving into a triumphant smile. Her eyes, however, flickered towards the grand entrance, a subtle, almost imperceptible sign of anxiety. The ghost of Serafina still lingered. In the society pages, she was a footnote, a prelude to the more exciting story of Julian and Isabella. But in the hushed gossip of the city's elite, she was a question mark. No one had seen her since the papers were signed. Rumors swirled that she had retreated to a Swiss sanatorium or was living in quiet shame in some forgotten corner of the English countryside. "The past is a cancelled check, my dear," Julian assured her, his confidence absolute. He was a man who never looked back, who only saw the next acquisition, the next victory. Serafina was a completed transaction, a line item, closed in the ledger of his life. The orchestra swelled, transitioning into a waltz. Julian led Isabella to the center of the floor. The other couples seemed to melt away, creating a wide circle around them, a silent acknowledgement of their supreme status. He was a surprisingly adept dancer, leading her with a firm, confident hand. As they twirled under the massive crystal chandeliers, bathed in the adoring light of 1,000 camera flashes, Julian felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power. This was his world. These were his people. And this beautiful, ambitious woman in his arms was his prize. He spun Isabella out and drew her back in their bodies, moving in perfect, practiced sync. The crowd was a blur of appreciative faces, a sea of diamonds and silks. He was at the absolute zenith of his life. The business was thriving, his messy divorce was behind him, and his future was as bright and alluring as the woman smiling up at him. It was in that precise moment of supreme self-satisfaction that a change occurred in the room's atmosphere. It began not with a sound, but with a feeling, a sudden collective intake of breath. A ripple of silence spread from the grand entrance inward, extinguishing conversations as it moved. The music faltered for a beat, as even the conductor seemed to lose his place. Julian, annoyed by the interruption, glanced over Isabella's shoulder towards the archway. He expected to see a late-arriving politician, or perhaps a royal. What he saw instead caused the blood to drain from his face, leaving behind a cold, creeping dread. The doors were held open by 2 footmen, and framed between them was a figure that was at once familiar and utterly alien. It was a woman poised and serene, her presence commanding the cavernous space with an effortless gravity. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, a creation so simple yet so perfectly tailored that it made every other dress in the room look overwrought and gaudy. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck. But it wasn't the woman herself that had stolen the air from the lungs of New York's high society. It was what rested upon the pale column of her throat. A cascade of brilliant, ice-white diamonds centered around a sapphire so large and so deeply blue, it seemed to hold the light of a dying star. It was a jewel of impossible rarity and legendary status. It was a masterpiece of the jeweler's art, a piece of history. It was the Star of Astoria, and it was resting on the throat of his ex-wife, Serafina Valerius, the woman who was supposed to be gone, the woman who was supposed to be broken, the woman who was most certainly not supposed to be here, wearing the one thing he had demanded back. The one thing his lawyers had told him was irrevocably hers. The waltz came to a clumsy, discordant halt. In the ringing silence, every eye in the grand atrium was fixed on the entrance. Julian's hand, still on Isabella's back, felt clammy and cold. Isabella's smile had frozen on her face, a brittle mask of disbelief. The apex predator, for the first time in a very long time, felt like prey. The ball was still his, but the night, he suddenly knew with sickening certainty, was no longer. The Star of Astoria was more than just a necklace. It was a saga written in diamond and sapphire. Forged in the late 19th century for an Astorian princess, it had passed through the hands of royalty, heiresses, and film stars, acquiring a patina of scandal and romance with each new owner. It was said to be cursed by some, a talisman of power by others. When Julian Thorne acquired it at a tense record-breaking auction at Sotheby's in Geneva, it was the ultimate corporate raid on history itself. He hadn't bought it for its beauty, but for its symbolism. It was a declaration that he, a man from new money, could own a piece of the old world, and he had given it to Serafina. It was on their 10th anniversary in the garden of their villa overlooking Lake Como. He remembered the look on her face when he'd opened the velvet box. She hadn't gasped or cried like other women might have. Instead, she had looked at it with a quiet, analytical reverence, the same way she looked at a company's balance sheet or a complex legal contract. "It's magnificent, Julian," she had said, her voice soft but steady. "But its real value is its story. And now its story is our story," he had replied, fastening the heavy, cold diamonds around her neck. "It belongs on a queen." At the time, he had meant it. Serafina Valerius was never just a wife. She was his partner, the silent architect of his empire. They had met in business school. He was the charismatic frontman, the risk-taker with the golden tongue. She was the strategist, the one who could see the intricate web of consequences and opportunities 3 moves ahead of anyone else. While he charmed investors and crushed rivals in the boardroom, she was the one poring over financial reports until 3 a.m., finding the single exploitable clause in a 1,000-page contract, drafting the white papers that would become the foundation of Thorn Global Dynamics. She never wanted the spotlight. She preferred the quiet hum of the back office, the thrill of a perfectly executed plan. She organized his life, curated his image, and most importantly, tempered his recklessness. She was the steel framework inside the glittering skyscraper he presented to the world. For 15 years, they were an unstoppable force, a perfect symbiosis of ambition and intellect. The necklace was a symbol of that partnership. When she wore it to board meetings or state dinners, it wasn't just jewelry. It was a message she was the other half of the throne, the keeper of the Thorn legacy. The first cracks in their foundation appeared subtly. Julian, having conquered the financial world, grew bored. He started craving a different kind of validation, public adoration, the fawning attention of the media, the kind of fame that came not from balance sheets, but from sheer personality. Serafina, who valued privacy and substance above all, saw it as a dangerous distraction. "You're building a cult of personality, Julian," she had warned him one evening, looking over a draft of a glowing magazine profile he was planning. "Empires built on one man's ego are brittle. Empires built on caution never get built at all." He'd retorted, the first real sting of resentment entering their conversations. He started spending more time at galas than in the office. He cultivated a circle of artists, actors, and influencers, people who dealt in the currency of celebrity, not capital. And it was in this glittering, superficial world that he met Isabella Vance. Isabella was everything Serafina was not. She was public where Serafina was private. She was effusive where Serafina was reserved. She celebrated his ego, fanned its flames, and made him feel not like a CEO, but like a king. She posted endless, artfully curated photos of their life on social media, on his private jet, at exclusive parties, in front of famous artworks. She was marketing him, and he, in his vanity, loved the product. Serafina discovered the affair not through a lipstick-stained collar, but through a discrepancy in an expense report. A charge for a suite at the Hotel de Crillon in Paris on a weekend. He was supposed to be at a tech summit in Berlin. It was a small, careless mistake, but to Serafina's forensic mind, it was as loud as a confession. The confrontation was quiet, clinical. It took place in his minimalist, glass-walled office, the city lights twinkling below them like a carpet of fallen stars. She presented him with the evidence dates, times receipts, as if she were presenting a hostile bid. He didn't even bother to deny it. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, a phrase that sounded hollow and rehearsed. "Things changed. I changed." "No," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "You just stopped listening to your chief strategist. This is a bad investment, Julian. She has no long-term value." That was what broke him. Not tears, not rage, but a cold, brutal business assessment of his new life. In that moment, he hated her for her composure, for making him feel like a foolish subordinate. The divorce was his scorched earth campaign. He was determined to win, to prove that he was the sole architect of his success. His legal team, a phalanx of the most ruthless lawyers in New York, was instructed to dismantle their shared life and leave him with the lion's share. He took the houses, the art collection, the company. He offered her a generous but insulting settlement attached to a draconian NDA that would silence her forever. His final demand had been for the Star of Astoria. "It's a Thorn legacy piece," he had told his lawyer, Richard Sterling. "It belongs to the family." Sterling had returned from the negotiation, looking pale. "There's a problem, Julian. The provenance. When you bought it, you signed a deed of gift. It was drafted by Valerius herself years ago and filed with the Gemological Institute and our family trust. It legally designates the necklace as her sole and separate property irrevocably. She says it was the first contract she ever drafted to protect an asset from a hostile takeover. Julian had been incandescent with rage. The sheer, calculating brilliance of it was a slap in the face. Years before any trouble, she had protected herself. She had used his own methods against him. In his haste to finalize the divorce and install Isabella in the penthouse, he had conceded the point, certain that Serafina would never have the audacity to wear it in public. He imagined she would sell it a final quiet surrender. He had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated her. Now standing frozen on the dance floor, Julian saw the truth. Her entrance wasn't a pathetic attempt to reclaim him. It was a strategic move planned with the same meticulous precision she used to gut a rival corporation. The midnight blue dress wasn't just a dress. It was a backdrop chosen to perfectly accentuate the impossible blue of the sapphire. Her serene expression wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the calm face of a general watching her battle plan unfold perfectly. He had thought he had buried the past, but the past had just walked into the room, wearing its crown, and Julian realized with a chilling certainty that the echo of his queen was far more powerful than the reality of his new consort. The story of the Star of Astoria had a new chapter, and it was about to be written in the ruins of his perfect night. The silence in the grand atrium was a physical entity, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the orchestra's last note and the idle chatter of 1,000 guests. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint rhythmic click of a photographer's camera from the press pit, a shutter opening and closing like a mechanical heartbeat. Serafina Valerius did not walk into the room. She took possession of it. She moved with an unhurried, deliberate grace that drew every eye. Her steps were silent on the marble floor. She was not looking for anyone in particular, her gaze sweeping over the sea of stunned faces with a look of detached, almost regal amusement. She seemed to be absorbing the collective shock feeding on it, transforming it into a palpable aura of power. Her transformation was breathtaking. The Serafina that high society remembered was a creature of the shadows, elegant, intelligent, but always standing just behind Julian, her presence a quiet complement to his bombast. The woman standing in the doorway was a different being entirely. The divorce had not broken her. It had fired her in a crucible, burning away the extraneous, leaving behind something hard, brilliant, and unyielding. The dress, an Oscar de la Renta creation, was a masterstroke of understated warfare. In a room filled with sequins, feathers, and vibrant colors, all screaming for attention. Its deep, starless sky blue was a void of pure elegance that made everything else look cheap. It was cut to suggest strength, not fragility, with a structured bodice and a clean, powerful silhouette. And then there was the necklace. The Star of Astoria was not merely being worn, it was being wielded. On Isabella, it would have looked like a trophy. On Serafina, it looked like an ancestral crown she had been born to wear. The colossal sapphire at its center seemed to pulse with a cold blue fire, each of the surrounding diamonds a shard of captured starlight. It rested against her skin, not as a gift from a man, but as a part of her, as natural and irrefutable as her own bones. It was a declaration more potent than any legal document or press release. This is mine. I am not what you remember, and I am not afraid. From the center of the dance floor, Julian watched, paralyzed. His mind, usually a whirlwind of calculations and strategies, was a void of white noise. He could feel Isabella's hand gripping his arm, her nails digging into the fine wool of his jacket. "What is she doing here?" Isabella hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. The mask of poised beauty was cracking, revealing the raw panic beneath. "And she's wearing my necklace." The possessive pronoun hung in the air between them, a testament to her profound misunderstanding of the situation. Julian flinched. He had, in a moment of foolish bravado, after the divorce, promised Isabella the necklace. He had told her it was a mere legal formality, that he would get it back. Now that lie was laid bare in front of the entire world. Serafina's eyes finally found his. There was no flicker of old affection, no hint of pain or regret. Her gaze was cool, level, and utterly unreadable. It was the look she gave to a business rival she was about to bankrupt, impersonal, assessing, and final. She held his gaze for a moment, then offered the slightest, most subtle of nods, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that was somehow more dismissive than a direct snub. Then she broke eye contact and turned her attention to Alistair Finch, Julian's oldest and most bitter rival, who was standing near the entrance, his jaw practically on the floor. A slow, genuine smile spread across Serafina's face as she moved towards him, extending a hand. The spell was broken. The room erupted. It wasn't a loud noise, but a tidal wave of whispers, a sibilant hiss that swept through the atrium. Phones were subtly raised. Guests turned to their neighbors, their faces a mixture of glee, shock, and awe. The narrative of the evening had been violently rewritten. The carefully constructed coronation of Isabella Vance had just been upstaged by the resurrection of the true queen. The photographers, sensing the shift, abandoned their polite distance. The press pit surged forward, a frenzy of flashing lights, now aimed not at the dance floor, but at the woman in blue. The rhythmic clicking became a deafening clatter. "Julian, do something," Isabella pleaded, her voice tight with desperation. She was watching her moment, her entire future being stolen in real time. But what could he do? To approach Serafina would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge her power over the room. To ignore her would be impossible. He was trapped in the spotlight, a king suddenly revealed to be naked. He let go of Isabella and took a half step forward, his instincts screaming at him to regain control, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. Serafina, meanwhile, was effortlessly charming Alistair Finch. Her laughter, a sound Julian hadn't heard in years, was clear and unaffected. Finch, a man known for his perpetual scowl, was beaming, hanging on her every word. She was not making a scene. She was holding court. Other powerful figures began to gravitate towards her, bankers, tech moguls, senators, forming a new center of gravity in the room. They weren't just greeting an ex-wife. They were approaching a wielder of influence. The band, recovering their composure, hesitantly began to play again, but no one was dancing. The party had bifurcated into two distinct camps, the stunned observers, watching the drama unfold, and the power brokers flocking to the new sun that had just risen in their midst. Julian finally understood. She hadn't come here for him. He was incidental. The grand entrance, the dress, the necklace, it was all just stagecraft. This was a power play aimed not at his heart, but at his empire. The weight of the Star of Astoria around her neck was symbolic of a different kind of weight she was about to bring to bear. And as he stood there, abandoned in the middle of the dance floor, with his beautiful, panicked consort, he felt the first tremors of the earthquake she had come to trigger. The crown jewel was just the opening salvo. Julian's paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of cold fury. This was his event, his territory. He would not allow her to hijack it. He strode across the marble floor, his movements stiff and deliberate, a path parting before him, as guests scrambled to get out of his way. The whispers followed him, a trailing wake of speculation. Isabella, left alone on the dance floor, was quickly surrounded by a coterie of her so-called friends, their faces masks of feigned sympathy that barely concealed their ravenous hunger for gossip. She was no longer the queen of the ball. She was a casualty, and the vultures were circling. Julian reached the cluster of power that had formed around Serafina. Alistair Finch saw him coming, and his smile tightened, a glint of sheer, unadulterated pleasure in his eyes. "Serafina, Julian," said his voice, a low, controlled growl. He had intended to sound intimidating, but it came out strained. She turned to face him, her expression one of polite, mild surprise, as if he were a junior associate she vaguely remembered. "Julian, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you'd be busier on the dance floor." The words were innocuous, but the delivery was a stiletto-sharp jab at his public display moments earlier. The men around her, titans of industry, who controlled trillions in capital, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the former husband and wife. This was better than theatre. "I think we need to talk," Julian said, keeping his voice down. "I don't believe we have anything left to discuss," she replied, her voice remaining light and conversational, forcing him to maintain the veneer of civility. "Our lawyers were quite thorough, as I recall. Don't play games with me, Sarah. What is this? What are you doing here wearing that?" His gaze flickered down to the necklace, a raw, possessive anger burning in his eyes. Serafina's smile never wavered. She gently touched the sapphire, a gesture both casual and deliberate. "This," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those closest to them. "It's a family heirloom. I thought tonight's Legacy Gala was the perfect occasion to wear it. It has such a remarkable provenance, don't you think, Alistair?" She had turned the question to Finch effortlessly, looping him back into the conversation and dismissing Julian in the same breath. Finch seized the opportunity with glee. Remarkable Finch boomed, clapping Julian on the shoulder with performative bonhomie. "A jewel of that stature belongs with someone who understands its history, its legacy, not just its price tag." You always had a finer appreciation for things than Julian Serafina. He always just saw the ticker symbol. It was a devastatingly precise insult, striking right at the heart of Julian's insecurity, the new money brute versus the old-world connoisseur. He could feel the blood rising in his neck. Before he could retort, Isabella appeared at his elbow. It was a tactical error. Desperate to reassert her place, she had walked directly into the lion's den. "Julian, darling," she cooed, sliding her arm through his. "Mrs. Astor is asking for you." She gave Serafina a dismissive, once-over glance, her eyes lingering on the necklace with a look of pure acid. Serafina's gaze fell upon Isabella for the first time. She didn't glower or scowl. She looked at her with an expression of profound pity, the kind one might give to a beautiful but foolish creature, unaware of its own impending doom. "Miss Vance," Serafina said, her tone gentle. "That is a truly stunning dress. The color is so bold." In Serafina's lexicon, bold was a synonym for vulgar. The veiled insult landed perfectly, and Isabella visibly bristled. Julian, seeing the exchange, knew he had to end it. "We're leaving," he said curtly to Isabella. He turned back to Serafina. "This isn't over." "No." Serafina agreed, her smile finally reaching her eyes, which now held a glint of cold triumph. "It's just beginning." As Julian steered Isabella away, the whispers in the room grew louder, more confident. The currency of the evening had shifted from wealth to information, and the most valuable stock was the story unfolding before them. Every glance, every coded word between Julian and Serafina was being analyzed, dissected and transmitted via encrypted texts and discreet murmurs across the ballroom. Serafina didn't stay in one place. She moved through the crowd like a monarch surveying her court. She didn't seek people out. They came to her. She had brief, meaningful conversations. With a Japanese tech investor, she discussed the future of quantum computing. With a German industrialist, she spoke of supply chain vulnerabilities. With Senator Carlson, she debated fiscal policy with a nuance that left his aides scrambling to keep up. She was not just socializing, she was demonstrating. She was reminding the world that she had been the brain of the Thorn Empire, that her intellect had not vanished with the signing of divorce papers. Julian, watching from across the room, felt a growing sense of dread. He had always taken credit for their shared success, and in the 6 months since she'd been gone, he'd believed his own PR. Now, seeing her in action, he was reminded of her formidable mind. He saw old allies and investors looking at her, then back at him, their expressions newly speculative. They were recalculating his value, and the equation was no longer in his favor. The final crushing blow of the chapter came not from Serafina, but from Richard Sterling Julian's own lawyer, who had been at the gala. Sterling approached him, his face ashen. "Julian, we have a problem," Sterling said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm aware of the problem," Richard Julian snapped, gesturing with his head towards Serafina. "No, not that. Well, yes, that. But something else. I just got a market alert. The pre-market futures for Thorn. Global dynamics just dipped 3 points. It's unheard of overnight. The Tokyo and London markets are reacting to something. The chatter is unstable leadership, public instability." Julian stared at his lawyer, the pieces clicking into place. This was a coordinated attack. Her appearance wasn't just a social maneuver, it was a market-moving event. The whispers in this room were not just gossip, they were signals being sent to the global financial community. The currency of whispers was being converted in real time into the hard currency of stock value. He looked back at his ex-wife. She was standing by the French windows, looking out at the city lights, a solitary, powerful figure. She wasn't just dancing with daggers. She had unsheathed a sword and was methodically, brilliantly cutting the legs out from under his throne. The evening's carefully managed schedule was now in tatters. The planned keynote speech by the mayor seemed trivial, the charity auction an afterthought. The only event that mattered was the one Serafina Valerius was orchestrating with a conductor's poise. The air was thick with anticipation, the crowd waiting for the next movement in her symphony of revenge. It came in the form of a man named Benjamin Carter, the host of the world's most respected financial news program, Market Makers. Carter was a journalistic silverback, a man who could move markets with a raised eyebrow. He approached Serafina not with the fawning deference of a society columnist, but with the keen intensity of a predator who has scented a paradigm-shifting story. His camera crew followed at a discreet distance, the red recording light a glowing beacon. Mrs. Valerius Carter began his voice, a familiar, authoritative baritone. "A surprise to see you here tonight. The world thought you had retired from public life. Reports of my retirement were greatly exaggerated." "Ben," she replied, a wry smile playing on her lips. They knew each other. Serafina had often been the one to prep Julian for his interviews with Carter, drafting the talking points that made him sound like a visionary. "The star of Astoria is causing quite a stir," Carter observed, gesturing to the necklace. "A bold statement. It's a beautiful piece of history," she said deftly, sidestepping the bait. "But I've always believed that the most valuable things are not those we inherit, but those we build." This was it, the pivot. Julian, watching from his self-imposed exile near the bar, felt his stomach clench. He knew her conversational style, the way she laid the groundwork before delivering the killing blow. Carter's journalistic instincts went on high alert. "Build. That sounds like you have a new project." "I do," Serafina said, her voice clear and carrying through the now silent room. The camera moved in closer. This was no longer a party. It was a press conference. "For the past 6 months, I haven't been retiring. I've been consolidating, reallocating assets. I've established a new private equity firm." A collective gasp went through the assembly. This was not the act of a scorned woman. This was a declaration of war. A new firm, Carter pressed, his excitement palpable. Competing with Thorn Global. Not competing, Serafina corrected him gently. Transcending. Thorn Global Dynamics, under Julian's leadership, has mastered the art of the hostile takeover. It's a model built on debt leverage and disruption. It's brilliant, but it's a 20th century playbook. My firm, Valerius Innovations, will focus on a different kind of growth, sustainable technology, green energy infrastructure, and ethical AI development. We won't be buying companies to strip their assets. We'll be investing to build their futures. The audacity of the announcement was staggering. In Julian's own house, in front of his most important investors and rivals, she had just declared his business model obsolete. She had framed him as the past and herself as the future. That's an ambitious mission statement, Carter said, clearly impressed. It requires significant seed capital and a flagship investment to prove the concept. Serafina's smile was serene. The capital has been secured. As for the flagship investment, I'm pleased to announce that this morning, Valerius Innovations completed its first major acquisition. She paused, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. Julian felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. He frantically scanned his memory for any potential targets, any vulnerabilities. We have acquired a majority stake in Helios Future Technologies. The name landed in the room like a bomb. Helios was a brilliant but struggling solar energy startup. They had developed a revolutionary photovoltaic cell that was twice as efficient as anything on the market. But they were running out of cash. Julian knew this because Thorn Global Dynamics had been actively working to bankrupt them for the last 3 months. He had initiated a short-selling campaign against their stock, choked their credit lines, and was preparing a lowball offer to buy their patents out of bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. It was a classic Thorn maneuver, and Serafina had just bought them. She hadn't just saved them, she had used his own attack to weaken the company, driving down the price to make her own acquisition cheaper. She had watched his strategy, anticipated his endgame, and executed a perfect counterplay, snatching the prize from his grasp at the last possible second. Julian stared at her, a look of horrified comprehension on his face. The settlement, the enormous single lump sum payment he had made to her. He had seen it as a payoff to make her disappear. She had seen it as seed money. He had inadvertently funded the creation of his own greatest rival, Benjamin Carter. Understanding the full brutal implications, looked directly into the camera. There you have it, a stunning move from Serafina Valerius re-entering the financial world, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap. Her new firm, Valerius Innovations, has just taken control of Helios Future Technologies, a company many believed was a prime target for acquisition by Thorn Global Dynamics. Global. The Queen, it appears, has made her first move in a new high-stakes game of chess. The interview concluded. The unveiling was complete. The necklace had been the symbol, but this was the substance. Serafina had not come to the gala to reclaim a man. She had come to launch an empire. She had turned the society event of the year into her personal eye-points. The stunned faces of the world's most powerful people were her witness. The star of Astoria on her throat no longer looked like a jewel. It looked like the first conquest of a new dynasty. The rest of the gala was a blur for Julian. The carefully constructed world he inhabited, a world built on the illusion of his singular genius, had been fractured in a single evening. He watched as his own investors, men who had clapped him on the back an hour earlier, now formed an orderly queue to speak with Serafina. Their handshakes were firm, their expressions animated. They were not just congratulating her, they were hedging their bets. They were diversifying their allegiance. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Isabella. Her face was a mask of fury and fear. The crimson dress that had seemed so powerful now looked garish, the color of an alarm bell. "We need to leave." Now she hissed, her voice tight with a desperate need to escape the hundreds of pairs of eyes that were now dissecting them with pity and morbid curiosity. Julian allowed himself to be led away, moving through the crowd like a sleepwalker. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. The short walk from the center of the atrium to the grand exit felt like a mile-long walk of shame. As they passed the alcove where Serafina was holding court, he risked a final glance. She was in deep conversation with the Japanese tech investor Kenji Tanaka, a man Julian had been courting for months. Tanaka was nodding intently, a look of deep respect on his face. Serafina did not even register Julian's departure. To her, he was already irrelevant. The ride back to the penthouse was silent and suffocating. The polished chrome and supple leather of the custom Maybach, usually a cocoon of success, felt like a hearse. Julian stared out at the glittering lights of the city that bore his name on half a dozen buildings, but he felt no ownership of it. He felt like a tourist in his own life. Isabella was vibrating with a silent, frantic energy. She kept checking her phone, her thumb swiping furiously through social media feeds. The story was already breaking, spreading through the digital world like wildfire. The headlines were brutal. The Thorn Empire strikes back. Serafina Valerius launches, rival firm, Red One. Revenge is a dish served with $1 billion buyout, declared another. Most damningly, a gossip site had a picture of Julian and Isabella on the dance floor, blissfully unaware next to a regal shot of Serafina at the entrance. The caption, "The King and his court jester," moments before the Queen arrived. When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, the argument that had been simmering finally exploded. "How could you let this happen?" Isabella shrieked, throwing her clutch onto a marble console table. "You told me she was finished. You told me she was a nobody without you. I thought she was—" Julian mumbled, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows and loosening his bow tie. The view of Central Park, his personal kingdom, offered no comfort. You thought Isabella's voice rose to a hysterical pitch. You built a $100 billion company on foresight, and you couldn't see this coming. She used your money, our money, to build a weapon to destroy you. It was her money, Julian said quietly, the admission tasting like ash. The settlement was hers. The necklace was hers. She outmaneuvered me, and you just let her, Isabella, pace the vast living room like a caged panther, standing there looking like a fool while she paraded around in my necklace. Julian whipped around his patience, finally snapping. "It is not your necklace. It was never going to be your necklace. Do you understand that it was hers? It was always hers." The raw truth of the statement silenced Isabella for a moment. Her face crumpled. The illusion of their fairy tale, the powerful billionaire sweeping the clever ingenue off her feet and showering her with the world's treasures, had been shattered. She wasn't his queen. She was his consort. A beautiful, expensive, and ultimately replaceable accessory. And the real queen had just demonstrated the difference between the two roles. So what was I? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. A distraction. A placeholder. Julian looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in months. He saw past the curated beauty and the ambitious fire. He saw a woman who had attached herself to his power, who had reflected his glory back at him, making it seem brighter. Serafina had never reflected his light. She had been a source of her own. He had traded a star for a mirror, and now the mirror was cracking. "You were what I thought I wanted," he said, the words heavy, with a dawning, sickening self-awareness. He had wanted adoration, not partnership. He had wanted a trophy, not a strategist. He had dismantled the most successful partnership of his life for the sake of his own ego. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" Isabella whispered, more to herself than to him. The security she had felt, the future she had so carefully plotted, was dissolving. Her value was tied directly to his, and his stock was plummeting. The shattering of their facade was complete. There were no more declarations of love or promises of a shared future. In their place was the cold, pragmatic calculus of a business relationship gone sour. He saw her for the opportunist she was, and she saw him for the flawed, arrogant man he had become. The gilded cage of their penthouse had become a tomb filled with the ghosts of his catastrophic misjudgments. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from his chief financial officer. It was one sentence: "The board is calling an emergency meeting for 7 a.m. Julian stared at the phone, then back out at the city. The light seemed to mock him. Serafina had not just humiliated him socially or attacked him financially. She had done something far worse. She had forced him to see himself stripped of his power and prestige, and he did not like the man he saw. The foundation of his empire was not stone, but sand, and the tide was coming in. Serafina did not leave the gala in a rush of triumphant adrenaline. She departed an hour after her announcement, having spoken to every person she had intended to speak to. Her exit was as poised and controlled as her entrance. She did not look back at the chaos she had wrought. She simply slipped out through a side exit into the cool night air, where a black, unadorned sedan was waiting for her. Not a limousine, but the vehicle of a woman who valued efficiency over ostentation. As the car pulled away from the curb, she finally allowed herself a moment. She leaned her head back against the leather seat and closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in quiet contemplation. She could still feel the phantom weight of every stare, the energy of the room shifting around her. It had not been an act of passion. It had been a corporate action executed on a personal stage. Revenge, she had decided long ago, was an emotional indulgence. Reclamation, however, was a strategic necessity. The car didn't head towards a lavish uptown apartment or a secluded townhouse. It drove towards the financial district, its streets dark and deserted at this late hour. It stopped before a sleek, modern skyscraper made of black glass and steel. A building so new it didn't yet feature on the city's skyline postcards. The lobby was minimalist, illuminated by a single glowing white desk. The logo on the wall behind it was simple, a stylized V. Valerius Innovations. She rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the top floor. The penthouse office was still Spartan, mostly empty, save for a large desk made of reclaimed wood and a wall of windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The view was different from here. From Julian's penthouse, one looked down on Central Park, a tamed, curated piece of nature. From here, she looked out at the throbbing heart of global commerce, at the towers of Wall Street, at the distant glow of the Statue of Liberty. It was a vista of work, of power, of ambition. She walked to the window, the city lights reflecting in the facets of the Star of Astoria. Gently, she reached behind her neck, unfastened the clasp, and lifted the legendary necklace from her skin. It felt heavy in her hands, a cold metallic weight. For years, it had been a symbol of her bond with Julian, a gift from a king to his queen. Tonight she had transformed it. She had used its history, its fame as a tool to write her own. She laid it carefully on the polished surface of her new desk. It was no longer a collar, however beautiful. It was now a spoil of war, the first of many. She had worn it for the last time. Her new legacy would not be defined by jewels given to her by a man. It would be defined by the companies. She would build the technologies. She would foster the empire she would create on her own terms. Her phone chimed. It was a text from her head of operations. Helios team is on standby. They're ecstatic, ready for the 8 a.m. integration call. Another message came in from Alistair Finch. Dinner next week. My firm would be very interested in exploring a strategic partnership with Valerius Innovations. A third alert, this one from a news app. Thorn. Global Dynamics TGD stock plunges in after hours trading, following shock announcement from founder's ex-wife. She read the messages without a flicker of emotion, processing them as data points. The plan was proceeding on schedule. This had never been solely about Julian. His betrayal was merely the catalyst, the external pressure that had forced a profound internal transformation. She had allowed herself to become the silent partner, the unseen hand. She had mistaken that quiet influence for true power. The divorce had been a brutal, painful lesson. Power that is given can always be taken away. True power must be seized. She had spent 6 months not in mourning, but in meticulous preparation. She had liquidated every asset the divorce had granted her, leveraged her reputation with discreet international banks, and assembled a lean, brilliant team of analysts who were loyal to her, not to the Thorn name. She had studied the market, identified its weaknesses, and found its next pressure point, the inevitable global shift towards sustainability. It was a sector Julian, with his slash-and-burn tactics, fundamentally misunderstood and arrogantly dismissed. His greatest weakness was now her greatest opportunity. Looking out at the sprawling, sleeping city, Serafina felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. It was not the giddy thrill of victory, but the serene certainty of a woman standing on solid ground of her own making. The ghost of the quiet, supportive wife was gone, banished forever. In her place stood an empress, surveying the dawn of her new empire. The night had been the announcement. The morning was when the real work would begin. Serafina Valerius's story isn't just about a spectacular act of revenge. It's a masterclass in reclaiming your power, rewriting your narrative, and turning the weapons formed against you into the very tools of your victory. She walked into that gala as a ghost from a billionaire's past and walked out as the future he never saw coming. Her crown jewel wasn't the sapphire on her neck, but the brilliant strategic mind that turned a painful ending into a world-shaking new beginning. What do you think was Serafina's most powerful move? Was it the grand entrance, the necklace, or the perfectly timed business announcement? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of strategy, power, and ultimate reclamation, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a story where the queen saves herself. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into a tale that feels torn straight from the headlines. Thank you for listening.